I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Kazakhstan, Russia, and Central Asia as a whole. What erupted early in the new year on the streets, in the cities, the towns, the villages even, of Kazakhstan looked startling enough. The proximate reason was a steep increase from about 13 cents to about 30 cents per litre of the fuel that most Kazakhstan people use to fuel their vehicles. It was either an uprising of the working class in Kazakhstan, furious at the rise, furious at the neoliberal reforms being introduced by the government, furious at the inequalities in the country, where a ruling caste, many of whom have been in place since the days of the Soviet Union, and absolutely enraged at the corruption of the oligarchy in Kazakhstan. Or it was a regime change operation, operated by the West, perhaps through proxies, perhaps through a rat run of ISIS and Al-Qaeda types from Afghanistan on one side, from Syria on another side. Or perhaps it was both. Or perhaps there's even a third way, a third option. Perhaps it was a section of the oligarchy mounting a coup against the other section, now preeminent in the state, and seeking to get back former privileges, former power. Or perhaps it was all three. The one takeaway that Western powers will not have missed is that if you're an ally of Russia, it moves fast to come to your aid, as people in the Middle East already knew from the example of Syria, where Western countries operating through proxies, satrapies in the Persian Gulf, tried to overthrow the government in Damascus, which was an ally of Russia, and Russia moved fast to their aid. Now, this is a lesson that might not have been missed across not just the Middle East, North Africa region, but more broadly across the world. If you're an ally of the United States, you end up like, I've even forgotten his name, the former president of Afghanistan, scurrying out, albeit with trunks full of cash, scurrying out of power when the United States cuts and runs into the night. Well, we have brought together a panel of distinguished experts. I'm only the enthusiastic amateur. Let's drill deep down into the events in Kazakhstan, establish what they really were all about, who were the actors involved, and whether this has any broader significance, particularly for the Central Asian region. My first guest that I introduce could hardly be better placed to discuss it. Dr. Galina Yemelyanova is from the School of Oriental and African Studies, Contemporary Central Asia and the Caucasus Department, where she's a research associate. But she's also author of Russia and Islam, and also the Muslims of Central Asia, and will shortly publish Islamic Leadership and State. Couldn't be better qualified. Dr. Galina, thanks for joining us. What really happened in Kazakhstan?
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure being here. Well, to begin with, I want to say that at this stage, we should be very careful with our assessment and conclusion of the events tragic events in Kazakhstan because of the lack of sufficient information and abundance of conflicting narratives of what's happened. So I would be very cautious and careful with what I am saying. So basically, we just don't know a lot. But on the basis of my academic knowledge of Afghanistan, I worked there, did research there, and on basis of my interaction with my informants from Almaty, I would say that there were two phenomena there which at the end conflated. One was peaceful protest, which went in Almaty, in main cities, Shymkent and Zhanaozen, Atirau, against, as you mentioned, the rise of prices for gas. But the economic situation was dire, has been dire in Kazakhstan for many years. And especially with prices for food, they continue rising, and impoverished people just struggled. So economic conditions were very poor. So the protest were kind of natural response, no doubt about it. But from the 3rd and 4th of January, we are witnessing different phenomena, and it's well-organized, well-armed young men of Kazakh ethnicity were kind of operating simultaneously across the country in the main cities, targeting administrative security services, buildings, businesses, airport in Almaty, and surprisingly, all of this were not defended. There was no protection at Almaty airport, which indicates that there was a well-planned operation. And according to my contacts in Almaty, a figure is pointed to 2 nephews of Nursultan Nazarbayev. One is Samat Abish, who was a deputy head of National Security Committee, and the other one, his brother, Kairat Sabalti, who is oligarch, but he's also Islamist. And he is notorious for supporting Islamism in the country, creating, even I was told, creating camps for training of Islamists. And he also kind of encouraged proliferation of people of Islamist view in security services on local level. So this is what I was told. I still be very cautious about it, but that these two kind of phenomena conflated. Now, what about external factor? This is difficult to say. My assessment is it's internal. The events are internally provoked, but the timing is strange, because it's happened when actually Russia and the West were at loggerheads because of Ukraine, and we don't know what's going to happen now after the Geneva talks failed. And then we also see Russians' kind of peacekeeping capacity stretched in Karabakh after the Second Karabakh War in Lachin corridor. So the timing is that maybe that it's used some interest in the West, of course, that to kind of destabilize Kazakhstan as a main ally of Russia and just undermine Russian positions along the very long border. So it might be. So there might be some sort of kind of trigger came from outside. But we have to know more about role of Ablazov, Mukhtar Ablazov, who is sitting in Paris, and was his role in it? Was he kind of connector? Was not? We don't know. And another potential actor who might be interested in destabilization is Turkey, because Turkey is kind of promoting pan-Turkist agenda in Central Asia for many years. Since collapse of Soviet Union, it was well represented in business and especially in the educational system of Kazakhstan. There was Turkish Kazakh University, Yasavi in Turkestan, in colleges across the country. And knowing Turkey and the role of Fethullah Gulen, for example, kind of until he fell out with Erdogan, these colleges and Fethullah people were penetrating security services. So if they were so active in Kazakhstan for 2 decades, so it might be that they were still there and they might be kind of triggered. And the fact that Turkey was quite subdued, reaction was subdued, also indicate that obviously it wasn't happy with what was going on.
Well, Erdogan certainly has dreams of a Turkic-speaking empire, a kind of new Ottoman empire. Maybe we'll come back to that. But a supplementary question to you, if I may. As it happens, I've been in Kazakhstan many times. It is amazing to me that you should describe the economic situation as dire, because to all intents and purposes, Kazakhstan is a fabulously rich country. The oligarchs, including the political class, live lives of unimaginable luxury. How did it come to pass that the economic situation was so bad?
Well, I suppose just the elite is too greedy, because it was just all accumulated within a very small number of people, all the wealth. If you kind of go through the family of Nazarbayev, especially all his son-in-laws, and how much wealth they amassed, and all oil and gas business is all controlled by the family.
Hugh Barnes, editor, a socialist, a green socialist and author, but more particularly in regard to this discussion, a war reporter. You've been at the front line in many conflicts. What did that conflict that you saw on the television look like to you? Did it look like a spontaneous uprising of angry citizenry, or did it look like something that was backed by outside forces?
Well, I think that Galina put her finger on it when she said that there seemed to be two phases, two facets of the uprising. I think in the west of the country, in the Mangistau region, which is a oil-rich region, it was genuinely, in the first instance, as you pointed out in your introduction, a spontaneous working-class uprising against the doubling of liquid petroleum gas prices, which people rely on to drive their cars. And that's what you saw over the beginning of the month. And then there was this second phase, which was kind of curious, when it moved into Almaty, which is the centre, really, of the Nazarbayev clan, the clan that has run the kleptocracy that has been Kazakhstan for the last 3 decades. And in Almaty, you saw possibly not just a kind of disgruntled, possibly unemployed youth movement joining the spontaneous uprising, but also a sense perhaps in which it had been exploited by elements within the regime, elements perhaps that had been sidelined by President Tokayev when he took over as the hand-picked successor of Nazarbayev in 2019. And what we might have been seeing, because there were interesting kind of aspects of it, the arming of the, in the West, it was a spontaneous kind of working class uprising. In Almaty, you saw something which looked much more like a coup d'etat. So the question is, was it manipulated by internal or external elements? I agree with Galina. My feeling is that it was probably an uprising which was hijacked by the Nazarbayev clan, people who felt that it was time possibly to kind of displace Tokayev because he hadn't been quite as submissive in carrying forward the regime that the Nazarbayev had overseen for 3 decades as they'd been hoping. And so what you'd seen, interestingly, the main telecoms tower was left undefended, the presidential palace in Sudan was left undefended, the airport was left undefended. The points of attack seemed to suggest a more coordinated coup attempt, possibly with the use of organised crime elements, thugs who were brought in to provide muscle. So you have to look at what might have been the causes. Now, Tokayev himself, he did talk about Islamist, terrorists, which to me seems a bit of a stretch. But he also, interestingly, Galina talked about Samit Abish, who is the deputy of the National Security Committee, who at the moment is on holiday somewhere. He hasn't actually been arrested, but his boss, Karim Masimov, who's a former prime minister under Nazarbayev, was actually arrested and has been charged with high treason. So it looks to me that the Tokayev regime...
There's a nice picture of him with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden that I saw on the internet the other day.
Well, he has his finger in a lot of pies, Mr. Masimov. He's been around a long time. He was called, for a period of time, the kingmaker, because, actually the last decade of Nazarbayev's reign was a period of time in which people were wondering how Nazarbayev was going to pass on the control of the state without finding himself in court on corruption charges because of the kleptocratic activities of his family. Galina talks about the inequality of the distribution of this fabulously oil and gas and mineral-rich country. But it's actually the case that 150 people associated with the Nazarbayev family own 60% of the Kazakh national wealth. Wow. So there's an inequality there. So, you have to look at Samit Abish, possibly Karim Asimov. It looks to me as if the Tokayev regime is now making moves to sideline the Nazarbayev clan.
I was going to ask that. Are they finished now, the Nazarbayevs?
Well, they've got, I mean, in addition to going after Abish and going after Masimov, they've displaced a Nazarbayev appointee who had been the Prime Minister, Asghar Mamin. Nazarbayev, in addition to the Satibaldis, Nazarbayev had two very powerful son-in-laws, Timur Kulibayev and Karat Sharipbayev, who run between them very important key energy assets within the country. Now, they have been angling for kind of some control in the succession for many, many years now.
David Lawley-Wakelin, documentary filmmaker, anti-war campaigner par excellence. How did it all look to you?
Well, it's fascinating. I'm surprised, George, that the speed with which Putin's troops were able to go in there. As you
Pretty
mentioned,
impressive, wasn't it?
I mean, as you said, his allies, he's there, bang on the doorstep. And that does leave me, as a filmmaker, looking very much from the outside, without the expertise of the lovely doctor and Hugh. I wonder, I'm suspicious, as with Crimea when the thugs went in, and then all of a sudden Russia was there, how much of this is actually possibly, as you said, there's so much, it could be, who could it be that's behind the guns? When guns get involved in demonstrations, I'm suspicious. And when they, as the doctors kindly pointed out, it wasn't just in Almaty, but in all the regional towns and cities across Kazakhstan, and there were guns used in not just one, but many, you have to be suspicious the greater power is behind it. The CIA, perhaps?
Well, maybe. Russia has cemented its position. If the West were involved and their purpose was to cause problems for Russia, they achieved the opposite, because Russia has once again demonstrated the precision, the power that they're able to put on the field.
And you have to think about Ukraine under those circumstances. Wouldn't Putin, what an advertisement for what he could do and so quickly do in Ukraine now, if NATO are intending to go any further up to his border that side. Look what I can do in Kazakhstan. You want me to do that in Ukraine as well? And how the speed, when lightning speed, it's now settled in Kazakhstan, it's all calmed down, the guns have been put away. I'm suspicious who is behind those.
That's your job, to be suspicious. Now, the last time I met this next guest was in Kazakhstan. He is Shiraz Paracha. He's a commentator and analyst on the region. He's settled there now with his family in Kazakhstan, but joins us from Pakistan because, well, he's marooned with the pandemic. Shiraz, welcome.
Thank you, welcome.
Shiraz, you now know Kazakhstan very well. Tell us a bit about what it's like there. What are the relations, tribal, clan, class relations between people in Kazakhstan?
I started going to Kazakhstan from London from 2001, and I lived and worked there continuously for 8 years at one of the leading universities. I now see Kazakhstan as my second home, and the reason I like is because it's very peaceful. The society is very harmonious, though there are 120 nationalities, ethnicities, people from different ethnic backgrounds live there, but they live in harmony. So I like Kazakhstan. It's good economically, it's modern, it's a digital society, very high literacy rate. So I'm surprised what happened there.
Why then are you surprised by the sheer bloodiness of the events of January 22 in Kazakhstan?
George, actually, surprised is not the right word. I'm stunned. I'm shocked. What I saw, though I am not in Kazakhstan now, I left the country due to the COVID pandemic, and then I couldn't go back in. But my loved ones are there. And what I saw on television screens and on social media, I mean, unbelievable, horrible, horrific tragedy.
The Kazakh regime sees foreign hands in these events, and also they mention, and there's evidence that points that way, to the presence of extremists, the kind that we know exist in Afghanistan, know exist in Syria. What's your take on that?
The facts will be out soon because the government has formed a commission to investigate what happened between January 2nd and January 8, 2022. But from the look of it, and as I said, we are very, shocked, stunned by this. If there were, you and I both participated in protests in London against the Afghan war, Iraq war. I saw protests in Afghanistan, even in Pakistan. But what we saw on the streets of Almaty and in other cities of Kazakhstan, those were not normal political protests, because the police officers there, security officers, were beheaded, 2 of them. 17 were killed. Police were first in the beginning, security forces were dealing with that unrest, and in Almaty city, like other normal, usual political protest. But when the people who were amongst the protesters are the protesters, when they start attacking police and 17 of them were killed, then, police stations were attacked, arms shops were looted, shopping malls were destroyed. So when President said this, in his address to the nation, televised address, and also to the emergency meeting of the heads of Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, he gave them evidence, and he said this was not normal. They were well trained. They were like sleeping cells inside Kazakhstan, particularly in and around Almaty. They have evidence that they were extremists, trained professionals, and he said they all were working under the central command, as if they had radio communications. So these were not normal protests.
Critics in the West, of course, criticize the use of foreign troops to put down this uprising, whomsoever was involved in it. And people say that the current president is now ruling thanks to Russian tanks. What do you say about that?
Wow, this is a typical, George. It's a typical Western double standards. I'm surprised that they have guts. They have this, courage to say that, while NATO troops are going everywhere around the world uninvited. They are in Eastern Europe, they are still in Germany, they are in South Korea, they are in Japan, they are in Philippines. They think they can fix problems in Ukraine. They are helping bring color revolutions, they have been bringing. So when NATO as an alliance can send its troops everywhere to change regimes, look what happened in Afghanistan. And yet they have the guts to say that foreign troops. No, they were not foreign troops in the sense, because Kazakhstan is part of Collective Security Treaty Organization, which has 6 member states. It was established 30 years ago. Now the ruling presidency of CSTO is with Armenia. So Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan are members of CSTO. Also Tajikistan, and they came to Kazakhstan on the invitation of the president, because when the Kazakh government realized that they thought that there was a foreign hand and they were not dealing with usual ordinary protesters, political protesters, they were dealing with an attack, what they call an attack and a coup d'etat effort.
Kazakhstan, was it a coup? Was it a revolution? Was it an invasion? Much more after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, talking about Kazakhstan and the reverberations that still are being felt in the region through the events of January 2022. Was it a coup? Was it a revolution? Was it an invasion? Well, who would want to invade Kazakhstan, one of the richest countries in the whole world, with a very, very long border with Russia and a decent-sized border with China? Hugh, isn't that the argument in favour of the theory that foreign powers had an interest in destabilising, regime-changing the government in what is now called Nur Sultan, that the strategic place that it is, the geopolitically strategic place that it is, would be an answer, wouldn't it?
Possibly, and I take your point. I mean, there has been in the former Soviet Union a history of so-called colour revolutions. We saw it in the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Tulip Revolution next door in Kyrgyzstan, and obviously in Ukraine with the Orange Revolution and 2014. There has been a pattern of external meddling in the internal politics of these former Soviet republics. I would say, though, that Kazakhstan is slightly different. I don't see the evidence. If the evidence is there, it would be very interesting to see it. I mean, what is significant about Nazarbayev's foreign policy over a number of decades was that he rather skillfully triangulated between Russia, China and the United States. I mean, one of the arguments against the kleptocracy of the Nazarbayev clan was that actually he was paid huge amounts of money by American businessmen to allow kind of American oil and gas companies into the country in the 1990s. So there is an argument against the Americans, and the Americans, have had a long-term interest in the fossil fuel and mineral wealth in Kazakhstan. But I would say that, interesting on David's point about Russia's, very prompt response to the uprising on the streets, Russia is looking at Kazakhstan, and it's also looking rather warily at China. And it was very concerned, in my opinion, that it wasn't a situation that China was able to exploit the unrest on the streets. And I think that the very delicate balance, you have the situation, there's been talk of a Islamist terrorist involvement. And Kazakhstan's on the border with China. China has its own terrorist threat posed by the Uyghurs in the west of the country, very close to the Kazakh border. This is a very complex picture. I haven't seen, as we saw in Georgia and in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, I think tangible evidence of Western interference in the political processes.
David, that is a key point. I, for what it's worth, agree with Hugh. I've not seen any evidence of overt, explicit Western intervention, except in this regard. These Islamist fanatic elements are all of them, at one time or other, clients of Western imperial power. The Al-Qaeda, ISIS phenomenon was generated either willfully or accidentally by Western policy in the region, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on. And they're not in short supply, these fanatics. We found them. We find them, of course, on the battlefield in Syria, but we also found them in Nagorno-Karabakh. We found people fighting for Azerbaijan who had previously been fanatic Islamists in Syria. The Uyghurs that were fighting in Syria were then found in Nagorno-Karabakh in that conflict with Armenia. So there are plenty of Islamist fanatic elements lying around to be used, aren't there?
Well, indeed, and there are. We do have credible reports of these two people having their heads chopped off.
Yeah, it's always a clue, isn't it?
Which suggests, we haven't had heads being chopped off before in Russians' other colour revolutions that they've dealt with. It was the swiftness with which this one was dealt with, and the fact that the guns stopped firing once the Russians arrived here, that, as I say, it finds me a little bit suspicious. And also China's silence. This is a massive border for China. It's got its Belt and Road initiative going straight through Kazakhstan and by road, all the roads they've built across the thing to connect the other 142 countries around the world that China has its ports and its train stations and its airports that they're building for this Belt and Road initiative. How come Russia was so quickly straight in there? We know they have their treaty, their security treaty with Kazakhstan, so China would naturally step back and say nothing. But I think there's so many unanswered questions in this one, and I think this is going to be a programme we'll be returning to, or your good self will be returning to in the months to come, because there's so many unanswered questions.
Well, let's hear from China. Einar Tangen from Beijing is a political and economic affairs commentator, a regular contributor to Chinese television, CGTN. He specialises in China affairs, but keeps an eye on the international situation also. Welcome.
Thank you, George.
Well, the president of Kazakhstan says that these events represented an attempt by foreign powers to destabilize, overthrow his government. What's your analysis of that?
That is not clear right now. I mean, there have been allegations that there are forces outside that were trying to do it. But there does appear to be a conflict between the previous president, the old president, and the current one. And that was quite apparent in a trip to Russia, where both appeared and talked to Putin. The president, the current one, was standing next to Putin in the picture. The past president was not. There were clearly some tensions between them. So it's purely speculation, but given that the older president resigned, Nazarbayev, from his position, there was obviously some sort of conflict there, and how far that went is not clear. There was a lot of speculation that somehow the United States was involved and was encouraging this, and that the Nazarbayev was the one was contacting them to see about their support. But this seems a little bit far-fetched, because the U.S. is not in a position to any way aid that. If U.S. intervention was even suspected, the Russians would have even moved in even quicker.
Given all of that, was President Putin right to say and act in defense of Kazakhstan and its current political configuration, given his determination not to be surrounded by enemies?
Well, it's not a question of right, but it's a question of what Putin's strategy is. I mean, this is not an isolated incident. You have Ukraine sitting in the background, or right before it was sitting in the foreground until this happened. And Putin has shown quite dramatically that he is willing and able to help groups surrounding him in terms of quelling any kind of act of rebellion. So at this time, it was put down as a terrorist attempt. It's not clear whether there's domestic or foreign terrorism. Either way, the mechanism worked very well for the current incumbent government. And this is really what Putin has done. I'm sure this has added to his popularity within his own country, as well as putting the country in his debt as it goes in future. The upshot of this is the United States is out.
Some said that China would not be happy with the CSTO Russian-led intervention in Kazakhstan. What is the official position in Beijing?
Well, very quiet. China has stayed on the sidelines on this. Obviously Russia has been growing closer and closer. One of the issues that comes up is Kazakhstan is, in fact, it has two gateways to this Belt and Road Initiative, this Silk Road Initiative that China had put out. The other one is through Russia itself. One of the links connects to the Russian Trans-Siberian Railway. So Kazakhstan is a key part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and being so closely under the influence of Russia, even though that they're very, very close allies at this juncture, is bound to cause some recalculation within Beijing.
China has a big stake, of course, through its Belt and Road Initiative in stability in Kazakhstan. Now that we've seen what we've seen already this year, how do you evaluate China's relationship now to Kazakhstan?
Well, we're at an inflection point. As you recall, the gas pipeline that Russia is trying to run to Europe is now in trouble. The new German government has indicated that they're willing to put it on hold. They haven't completely said they're going to get rid of Nord Stream 2. But if, in fact, Nord Stream 2 is a bust, Russia really has only one alternative, and that is to go more towards China. Now, that strengthens the relationship, but I don't know how they're going to feel about China running, ways to Europe, which they're in essence turning their back on. So, I mean, there will be some inborn kind of conflicts. I don't think that they're going to ruin the partnership, but it certainly represents two countries going in two different directions. Obviously, China wants to keep trade with Europe. It's an important market going both ways. Obviously, it needs to keep good relations with Russia.
It's clear that there are legitimate concerns amongst the population in Kazakhstan. Are they being exploited? Are these concerns being exploited by the West or by Russia?
No, I don't think it was. Look, the situation was as it was. It appears that when they lifted this cap on natural gas, and many people within the country, because natural gas was cheaper, had converted their cars to natural gas, it caused a lot of outspread outrage. Times are tough. Although a very wealthy country by the standards of that area, the fact is there's a lot of inequality, especially when you get into the rural areas. It then appears that inside or outside forces, or a combination thereof, thought that this was the time to instigate a color revolution underneath this kind of discord. It failed. Things are going forward. Russia came to the rescue. Obviously, Kazakhstan and this government are going to remember that. And as a result, as I said before, the upshot of this is the US is definitely out. And Russia and China are definitely getting closer together. How does this geopolitical landscape start to reshape itself under these things? And a lot of that will depend on, as I said before, what happens in Europe, especially with Nord Stream 2.
Well, the world is currently fixated on the situation on the border between Russia and the Ukraine, with talk of war everywhere. To what extent are the events in Ukraine and the events in Kazakhstan related?
No, not really. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is prompted by unrelenting pressure from Moscow's position that NATO keeps advancing into areas where they said they would not. That was, although it was never in writing, it was clearly understood by both sides that NATO would not continue expanding into, the Soviet bloc countries. Russia has been historically very sensitive about having any opposition directly on its borders. And this has been borne out by history, and you see it happening today. They do not want missiles in Ukraine aimed at Moscow, where they could hit the city within 6 to 7 minutes. So for Russia, it's very, very clear that the West has violated the terms of what they perceive the agreement. It's, in essence, it would be the same thing if Russia was putting missiles in Canada aimed at Washington. A very dim view of that, I'm sure, in the US. From the US point of view, they say, well, we can't control what sovereign countries do. If they want to join NATO, that's fine. But this is the kind of stuff that, basically sleepwalk into wars and armed conflicts. You'll note that things have changed dramatically, whereas everyone was talking about Taiwan just a few weeks ago. Now all attention is focused on Ukraine and those areas.
Well, let's ourselves focus on that, Doctor, because none of what happened in Kazakhstan happened in a vacuum. We had an attempted color revolution in Belarus, which seems to have failed, an attempted color revolution in Kazakhstan. Let's agree that that is one take on those events. But the whole world is now listening to Mr. Lavrov, for example, saying that Russia is ready to go, that we have lost patience with NATO. The talks in Vienna and Brussels in January failed. Are we looking seriously at war in Europe between Russia and NATO?
Well, I don't think we're looking at war, no. But it's very worrying what's going on now with Ukraine. But I don't think it escalates to the extent of the war. And Russia, as was mentioned by a previous speaker, has credible reason to be tough, not to allow deployment of Western missiles on its border. So in this sense, I suppose it's a kind of new version of a Cold War. But I don't think it escalates because it would be the end. Politicians should understand it will not go to it. No, I doubt it. But the situation is more complex than this. It's not just confrontation on the kind of model of previous Cold War between Soviet Union and America and Western allies. Now we have more multi-dimensional, multi-leveled and complex confrontational atmosphere of a confrontational international system. So we have, yes, now confrontation between Russia and the West and China and the West. But within this confrontation, there are a lower level of confrontations, like was mentioned. The relations between Russia and China are very complex over Central Asia, because not just because of Breeze's Belt and Road Initiative, but generally it's a conflict area, because Russia was culturally dominant, but it's losing its economic position to China. So it's not very kind of peaceful relations in a way. It looks okay, but in reality, underneath, China is advancing in Kazakhstan, which is not very welcomed by Russians, and that's probably why Chinese kind of took very careful and cautious position during this event, and just insisted that it's internal matter of Kazakh people, and no intervention external, including Russian, should be done.
David, what say you? War or no war?
Well, I think since the Bay of Pigs, this is the most dangerous time we've ever had in our recent history. I would just somewhat be less cautious. Perhaps the glass is half empty for me and half full for you, Doctor, but I find this terribly dangerous now, because there is a real standoff now between the West and America and NATO, saying we're not incurring into Ukraine, and Russia and Putin saying, well, if you come any closer, it's gloves off. And who's to say how such a conflict might start? Would it be infiltrated by thugs that are sent in to stir up a little bit of trouble in Ukraine, and then Putin has to go and rescue its Russian, which is, I think, something like 40 or 50% of the Ukraine population is Russian still, and will he have to do what he did in Crimea and go in, to save the whole situation? And whilst our backs are turned looking at that situation, will then China see the opportunity to go to Taiwan once that has started? This to me is the closest we've been to World War III in our lifetimes, George.
Yeah, in my lifetime also, and I'm older than you. You can be sure if a war begins over Ukraine, there will also be a war with Taiwan. You can be.
It's another possibility. Yes, that's the elephant in the room.
Of that. Yeah. Hugh, you're the man that's been closest to wars. You've been reporting on them. You've been there. How worried are you about conflict? The United States this month has said that they're expecting Russia to mount a false flag operation to justify a movement of forces into presumably just eastern Ukraine. I don't think anyone's speculating that the Russian army is going to be in Kiev. That I don't know, of course, about a false flag operation. You can have a triple agent. Maybe the United States will create an event that they'll call a false flag that will bring about this confrontation. But I'm with David rather than Dr. Galina. I think it's highly likely that we're going to have a conflict in Ukraine.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that we already have a conflict in Ukraine.
Yes.
It's a frozen conflict.
Yes.
The conflict that began in 2014 never came to an end. And actually, it's kind of Russian dissatisfaction, justifiable dissatisfaction with the fact that some aspects of the Minsk II peace accord have not been laid out, that is kind of behind a lot of this. But I think NATO has no appetite for sending troops into Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is a much more confident, a much more professional operation than it was in 2014, 2015. And there are some difficulties within, some of the nationalistic elements within the Ukraine regime. I actually don't believe that there will be a war in Ukraine. I think that it's in neither side's interest. But what I think is interesting is that you talk about Belarus. The Belarus, Kazakhstan and Russia are all founder members of the Eurasian Economic Union. And Putin, one of the things he objects to, I think, about Ukraine is not a model of kind of democratic, neoliberal, prosperous, redistributive success. But Putin does not want to see a democratic success on his immediate border, just as Lukashenko doesn't want to kind of capitulate in any way to the opponents that kind of arguably won the 2020 general election there. So you have this situation in which the democratic deficit, in my view, in Kazakhstan, in Belarus and in Ukraine has always been problematic for the Russians, because in terms of their long-term interests, you could argue that some of the same tensions and some of the same difficulties are there within the Russian Federation that we see just on the other side of its borders.
Well, you say that, but the main opposition force in Russian politics is the Communist Party. It's Putin or the communists.
I agree, and the Russian political system is a more sophisticated, it is a more open opposition parties. You know, there is what they call a systemic opposition, an opposition which to some extent has been co-opted. I'm not talking about the communists now, but I mean the Russian political system is a more advanced, more sophisticated model than what we see in Belarus or indeed in Kazakhstan, where opposition doesn't exist in any
Ukraine. In Ukraine, the president has shut down the opposition television stations. 2 of his presidential opponents are under arrest. I mean, there are Nazis goose-stepping in the streets. There are banners of the Nazi collaborator Bandera. I mean, you said there are problems with Ukraine's democracy, but these are pretty big problems.
They are pretty big problems, and they're generic problems. If you live in any society where there is inequality, where there is corruption, where there is a democratic deficit, where there is a lack of freedom of expression, and where there are constraints on civil society, and I'm talking about the United States of America or the United Kingdom now too, if you live in any society where those things pertain, you will get disgruntlement and protest, and occasionally it will spontaneously combust. And that is what we saw in 2014 in Ukraine. It's what we saw in 2022 in Kazakhstan. And I'm sure we'll see it in countries in the West in the future too.
Spontaneous combustion, Hugh thinks, is what happened in Kiev in 2014. But there surely was an example of blatant, overt Western intervention in what eventually happened. I mean, John McCain was actually down there in the square. Members of the European Parliament were down there in the square. Victoria Nuland was on the telephone.
Distributing.
And telling the EU to, you know what, themselves. So, I mean, whilst I agree with you that I don't actually believe that the Americans tried to overthrow the regime in Kazakhstan, but I absolutely know that they tried to and succeeded in overthrowing the regime in Kiev. So Russia has a right, a responsibility, a duty. Putin has a duty to take seriously the presence on his immediate borders of potentially hostile states, doesn't he?
Yes, I agree. Yes, and he reacted swiftly. Yes, I think it was done in a day or two delay. It might end up like in Ukraine. I think you're right. He did it just in time. He has the right to do it. And what we have to watch now, that despite what Blinken was saying, if Russians come, they stay. So withdrawal was just after from 13th of January, they start withdrawing. So they helped and they left. So obviously it wasn't the idea wasn't of occupation or sort of...
Unlike South Korea or Afghanistan or whatever.
Yes, it might affect now. It stabilized Tokayev, and probably for a while it kind of put an end to multi-vector foreign policy of Kazakhstan, and it would have to pay its debt to Russia.
Hugh has a real point there, and I saw it with my own eyes. The last time I was in Almaty, the former head of the CIA was trying to force his way into my hotel bedroom in the middle of the night. He said he was sleepwalking, but I'm not sure I believe it. But no, he was sleepwalking. He apparently has that problem after a few glasses. But that's how close this multi-vector approach of the Nazarbayev family to the Americans was. The former head of the CIA was in the next room to me. So that's got to end, I would have thought. most of the new contracts will now be going to Moscow rather than to American companies, won't they?
Well, it's very difficult to say because the oil and gas, it's not just American companies, British were very, very active there as well, and Chinese actually is the most ruthless one. Because where Chinese, there is complete kind of depopulation and ecological problems, but it's all there. And will Tokayev be up to it? To change, redistribute, kind of move it from the West straight away? It will be impossible. Second factor we have to watch, because he's inside of Nazarbayev, he's one of them. For 30 years he was next to him. His son Timur and his brother-in-law, they're kind of controlling this Abbey petrol capital in Atirau. So the oligarchs. So how he's going? He has to kind of to deal with his own family then. You know, it's very difficult. Will he up to deliver what he promised? Change economical situation, change investment, support small and medium business, and do all sorts of things. When actually it will undermine position of his relatives as well. So this is
maybe there'll have to be another revolution in Kazakhstan. We could talk about this for the rest of the evening. I hope you will think about it for the rest of the evening. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة on Al Mayadeen television. Thank you for watching.